Picture this. You're standing in what looks like the surface of Mars. Cracked earth stretches to the horizon. Not a blade of grass. Not a drop of water. Just dirt, salt, and the kind of heat that makes you question your life choices. Then someone shows up with a truck full of buffalo and says, "We're letting them loose here." You'd think they'd lost their minds. The buffalo would be dead in a week, right? Dead wrong. What happened next didn't just save the buffalo. It resurrected an entire ecosystem that scientists thought was gone forever. And it all started because Israel made one of the most bizarre environmental decisions in modern history. Keep watching, because this story gets wild. Let's rewind. The year is 2007, and we're talking about the Hula Valley in northern Israel. Now, if you've never heard of the Hula Valley, don't worry. Most people haven't. But this place has a story that'll make you rethink everything you know about nature. Human intervention. And what happens when you try to fix a mistake that's decades old? The Hula Valley used to be a wetland. Not just any wetland. We're talking about one of the most biodiverse spots in the entire Middle East. Imagine thousands of birds stopping here during migration, fish everywhere, plants you couldn't find anywhere else on Earth. It was basically nature's five-star resort. But then the 1950s happened. And with it came one of those ideas that sounds great on paper but turns into an absolute disaster in practice. Israel decided to drain the swamp. All of it. The goal? Create farmland. Feed a growing population. Turn a useless wetland into something productive. They drained about 15,000 acres of pristine wetland. Gone. Just like that. And at first it seemed like a win. Farms popped up. Crops grew. Mission accomplished, right? Nope. Nature doesn't work like that. Within a few years, the soil started doing something weird. It began to disappear. Literally. The peat soil, which had been underwater for thousands of years, suddenly found itself exposed to air and sunlight. And peat soil, when it dries out, does two things. First, it oxidizes. That's a fancy way of saying it breaks down and releases carbon dioxide. Lots of it. Second, it catches fire. Spontaneously, the Hula Valley became a ticking environmental time bomb. Farmers started noticing their fields were sinking. Not like a little bit. We're talking meters. The ground was collapsing beneath their crops. And the fires. Those became a regular thing. Underground peat fires that could burn for months, releasing toxic smoke and destroying everything above them. But wait, it gets worse. Remember those 15,000 acres of farmland? They started producing something nobody wanted. Nutrients. Too many nutrients. All that fertilizer and decomposing peat was washing into Lake Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, which happens to be Israel's main freshwater reservoir. The lake started choking on algae blooms. Fish were dying. The water was becoming undrinkable. By the 1990s, Israel realized they'd made a massive mistake. So they did something almost unprecedented. They decided to reflood part of the valley. Not all of it. They couldn't give farmers back their land. But about 800 acres got turned back into wetland. They called it the Agamon Hula. And here's where our buffalo enter the story. Sort of. Because first we need to talk about what happened when they reflooded the area. It didn't go as planned. Shocking, I know. The water came back. The birds came back. Thousands of cranes started using the valley as a rest stop during their migration between Europe and Africa. Some estimates put the number at over 40,000 cranes at peak season. That's a lot of very large, very hungry birds. These cranes weren't just passing through anymore. They were stopping to feast. And what were they feasting on? The farmers' crops. Specifically peanuts and corn in the surrounding fields. The farmers were losing millions. The cranes were basically running an all-you-can-eat buffet on someone else's dime. Israel had a problem. They'd spent years and millions of dollars recreating this wetland to fix their earlier mistake. Now the wetland was working too well. The birds were thriving. But the farmers were furious. They wanted the birds gone. Some wanted to drain the valley again. The situation was a political nightmare. Environmentalists versus farmers. Tourism versus agriculture. The cranes had become both a blessing and a curse. Something had to give. That's when someone had an idea. An idea so strange that most scientists thought it was crazy. What if instead of fighting the vegetation that was growing out of control in the wetland, what if they brought in animals to manage it naturally? Big animals. Really big animals. Enter the water buffalo. Now these aren't your typical American bison. These are Asian water buffalo, also called carabao, and eating pretty much any plant they can find. And unlike cows, they're built for wetlands. Their wide hooves work like snowshoes in mud. They can wade through water that would bog down any other livestock. But here's the crazy part. Israel didn't have any water buffalo. They're not native to the region. They had to import them. And when the first small herd arrived in the early 2000s, people thought it was a publicity stunt. What were these tropical animals supposed to do in a Middle Eastern wetland? As it turns out, the buffalo were released into the Agamon Hula, and they got to work. Not because anyone trained them. Not because they were following some environmental management plan. They just did what buffalo do. They ate. A lot. An adult water buffalo can consume up to 40 pounds of vegetation per day. They're not picky eaters either. Reeds, grasses, invasive plants, whatever. If it's green, it's food. Within months, something remarkable started happening. The out-of-control vegetation that was choking parts of the wetland started to thin out. Open water appeared where there'd been nothing but dense plant growth. And with that open water came more biodiversity. Different species of birds, fish, amphibians. The ecosystem was balancing itself, but the buffalo weren't just eating. They were engineering, and they didn't even know it. When buffalo walk through wetlands, their massive hooves churn up the mud. This does several things. First, it prevents the soil from compacting and becoming dry. Second, it creates varied terrain. Some spots get trampled into shallow pools. Others get left alone and grow tall. This variation creates different microhabitats for different species. Their waste played a role too. Buffalo manure is nutrient-rich, but it's distributed naturally across the landscape. Unlike farm runoff that concentrates nutrients in one place causing algae blooms, buffalo fertilizer spreads out. It feeds the plants. The plants feed the insects. The insects feed the birds. Classic ecosystem cycling. Scientists started calling the buffalo ecosystem engineers, a term usually reserved for beavers and elephants. Animals that don't just live in an environment but actively reshape it in ways that benefit dozens of other species. But the story gets better. Remember those 40,000 cranes that were destroying farmers' crops? The buffalo helped solve that problem too. By managing the wetland vegetation, the buffalo created better habitat within the reserve itself. The cranes found more food inside the protected area. Crop damage dropped significantly. Farmers went from wanting to drain the valley again to tolerating, and in some cases even supporting, the wetland. Some started offering tours. Birdwatching became big business. Tourists were paying good money to see the cranes, the buffalo, and the restored ecosystem. The valley became one of the top ecotourism destinations in Israel. Now, the herd that started with just a handful of buffalo grew. As of recent counts, there are over 300 water buffalo living in and around the Agamon Hula. They've become a permanent part of the landscape, and they're not penned in. They roam freely, managing the vegetation naturally, requiring almost no human intervention. But the implications of this go way beyond Israel. Scientists from around the world started paying attention. Could this work elsewhere? Could large herbivores be reintroduced to damaged ecosystems to help them recover? In many cases is yes. We've seen similar projects with bison in North America. The Great Plains used to support tens of millions of bison. They shaped the landscape. Their grazing patterns prevented woody plants from taking over. They created the prairie. When we killed off the bison, we lost that natural management. Now conservation groups are reintroducing bison to see if they can restore degraded grasslands. Early results are promising. Countries like the Netherlands have reintroduced wild horses, cattle, and deer to reclaim damaged landscapes. The idea is simple. Let nature do the work. Let animals reshape the environment the way they did for thousands of years before we remove them. But back to Israel and the buffalo. The success of the Agamon Hula project did something unexpected. It changed the national conversation about conservation. Israel is a small country with limited land. Every acre is contested. Agriculture, development, and conservation are in constant competition. The buffalo proved that conservation doesn't have to be a dead weight on the economy. Done right, it can support tourism, education, and even agriculture by managing pest species and improving local ecology. The Hula Valley buffalo became a symbol, a proof of concept, and their influence spread to other projects. Israel started looking at other degraded areas. Could similar approaches work in the Negev desert, in coastal wetlands? The buffalo showed that sometimes the best technology is no technology at all, just animals doing what they've evolved to do for millions of years. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the scale of impact is genuinely stunning. The restored wetland now supports over 390 bird species. That includes endangered species that had completely disappeared from the region. The water quality in Lake Kinneret improved. Agricultural runoff decreased. Carbon sequestration increased as wetland plants grew back and peat stopped oxidizing. Tourism revenue from the Hula Valley exceeds tens of millions of shekels annually. That's money flowing into a rural area that desperately needed economic development. Jobs were created, not in some high-tech startup, but in guiding tours, managing the reserve and supporting the infrastructure around it. And the buffalo? They just keep doing their thing, eating, waiting, and reshaping the landscape. One muddy hoofprint at a time. They don't know they're heroes. They're just living their best buffalo lives in a wetland, against all odds, came back from the dead. There's a lesson here that goes beyond environmental science. It's about humility, about recognizing when we've made a mistake and having the guts to fix it, even if that fix seems radical or expensive. Israel could have doubled down on draining the swamp. They could have blamed the birds, the weather, bad luck. They admitted they were wrong and tried something different. The Hula Valley story also highlights something we tend to forget in our modern, technology-obsessed world. Sometimes the best solutions aren't the newest or the most complex. Sometimes, the answer is to step back and let nature do what it does best. The buffalo didn't need training. They didn't need supervision, water, and food. The rest took care of itself. This isn't to say humans don't have a role. We do. We screwed up the valley in the first place. But our role isn't always to control or dominate. Sometimes it's to facilitate, to create conditions where natural processes can resume, to reintroduce the missing pieces, and then get out of the way. The global implications are massive. We're facing ecosystem collapse on multiple continents. Wetlands, forests, grasslands, and coral reefs are dying. Climate change is accelerating the damage. But projects like the Hula Valley show us that recovery is possible. Not everywhere, not always, but more often than we think. Other countries are taking notes. India, which has massive wetland restoration needs, has studied the Hula model. China, dealing with desertification and agricultural runoff, has sent delegations to see the buffalo in action. Even the United States, with its own history of drained wetlands and degraded prairies, is looking at how large herbivore reintroduction can support conservation goals. The buffalo in the Hula Valley aren't just animals anymore. They're ambassadors, living proof that we can undo some of the damage we've caused. That ecosystems are more resilient than we give them credit for. And that sometimes the wildest idea is the one that actually works. So next time you hear about some crazy conservation project, some weird reintroduction of an animal that doesn't seem to belong, remember the Hula buffalo. Remember that in 2007, someone looked at a dying wetland and thought, you know what this needs? Buffalo. And everyone else thought they were insane. Until it worked. Until the land came back to life. Until the whole world started paying attention. That's the power of thinking differently. Of trusting natural processes. And of understanding that sometimes the best thing we can do for the planet is bring back what we took away and let it do its job. The buffalo didn't stun the world, because they're magical. They stunned the world because they showed us what's possible when we give nature a fighting chance.